Hi y'all, I'm sorry I'm missing class with you today. This is this day I'd especially like to be there because this is talking about a country that's very near and dear to my heart. But I'm hoping to be back with you next week when I've gotten a little bit of rehabilitation in my hip. At any rate, today we're going to be talking about Niger. And you've already seen a video and read a couple of articles about Niger, so you know a little bit about it. But I'm going to try to give you sort of the essential pieces of understanding agriculture in Niger from the standpoint of what kind of crops they grow and what the labor patterns are like to some degree. So we're starting off here looking at the village where I lived and worked for part of my time in Niger for about 2 years total, including my master's research. And I lived in Niger for 3.5 years, including the time I was a Peace Corps volunteer and the time that I was a master's student. And what you're seeing here is, first you can tell there's a road going through, and that road is actually a pathway for livestock. And all of those branches that you see along the pathway are to keep livestock contained to the pathway so that they don't go out into the fields and trample the crops that are there. And that's because a lot of the year, animals are allowed out into the fields. They use those fields to graze, they eat weeds, they eat what's left of the crops. But clearly when the time is in the midst of rainy season, when you're growing your crops, and especially right now, as you can see, the millet is just starting to grow, those are times when you want to keep the animals out. So that's one of the patterns to understand about Niger that's quite a bit different from a lot of what you see in the United States, is it is fairly integrated. The animals are very much part of the system, but only at the proper times of year. They're not always part of the fields. Sometimes they're separated out and they have to go graze somewhere else during those times of year. Another thing to notice is that you can see a tree in the field, right in the midst of all of that millet. So all of those, and if you look on the left side there of the front foreground of the picture, on the left side of all of those briars, then all of that green that you're seeing, that's not the tree, that's millet plants growing up, probably in their first few weeks of growth after they've gotten a good rain. And the tree is quite a bit different from what you're used to seeing in most fields in the United States, right? So we've seen these big cleared areas, certainly for large-scale agriculture, and those big cleared areas are because you need to get your tractor in there. Well, these fields in Niger, they're being worked almost exclusively by hand, and you saw a little bit of that in the video. So people are working out there with hoes and sometimes pulling weeds by hand if they're gathering weeds that they're going to take home to eat. And so you don't have a need for a tractor in there, and so you can have trees. And trees are actually an advantage. So the trees will be drawing nutrients from much deeper than the millet will ever reach. And as it brings those nutrients up, and as the leaves die and fall onto the field at different times during the year, those leaves are going to add nutrition to the field. So they actually help to make the field richer. And another thing to keep in mind is that, and you're going to see a little bit more about this in a minute why, but the winds tend to blow very strongly across these fields, so having trees in fields helps to keep your soil in place. It helps to limit wind erosion because it slows the wind down and helps to ensure that a little bit more protection is there for the soil. Another thing to see in this image, you can see in the background there's the village itself. You're looking at the edge of a couple of people's compounds. So people spend most of their time outside in Niger, but they do sleep inside, for example, during the rainy season. So all of the flat-topped structures, those are people's houses. So that's where they store things. That's where they sleep when it's cold or when it's rainy. And then the round-top structures, those are granaries. The round top is it's structured so that it keeps animals out. So the whole side, and you'll see it from the side in a little while, but the whole side is protected from animals partly by being raised up off the ground on bricks and sticks. And then you can only get into the granary by putting a ladder up against the side and crawling through the hole on the top. And the round structure to the right, you can see that there are two of them sitting right next to each other, and the one on the right doesn't have its roof on it. The one on the left has its roof, so you just pull that roof off. It's just made of millet stalks, keeps the rain out, but it's very easy to move away. And you can also see some cattle there, so you get, again, that glimpse of how the system is integrated. The cattle and the plants kind of work together in this system. Okay. All right, and another thing to know as we're getting started here is where we're talking about. So Niger is in West Africa, and one of the things to know about that is that if you took the United States and you put the far western United States, Washington State and California, up against the west coast of West Africa there, where that big bulge is on the left, the United States would stretch out east to about where the eye in Africa is. So that just is to give you a sense that Africa is a huge continent. And so even Niger, although it doesn't look like a very big country on this map, it's actually quite large in terms of land area. It's more than the size of Texas, let's say. And you can also see something important about Niger, which is that it's landlocked. So it doesn't have access to ports. And so it doesn't have the ability to export a whole lot of things to countries that are across the ocean, but it does have connections to countries that it can ship by truck transport to. So Nigeria is just to the south of it. Nigeria is the big country that you can see right south of Niger. And then you can also see that Niger touches Togo as well, that's Benin, and Burkina Faso to the west and the south on that far western portion of Niger. And the area that I'm talking about, if you look at the map on the right, is the region of Tawa. So I lived in the region of Tawa for all of my 3.5 years in the area. And Tawa, as you can see, runs north-south, and I lived far, far to the south near the Nigerian border. And the capital of the country is Niamey. So if you look far to the west in that portion of the country that sort of sticks out from the rest to the west, that area called Niamey, that's the capital. And where I lived in Tawa, that's about a 6-hour bus ride away. So you can tell it's a bit farther than you might guess just based on looking at the map. And another thing to know about the location of Tawa and of Niger is that most of the country is in a region called the Sahel. And if you look north of this region that's labeled as the Sahel, that area where it's all tan, most of that is the Sahara Desert. So if you've seen any images of the Sahara, it's quite dry. There are places where it is actually big rolling dunes, just like the stereotypes you see. There are also places where it's rocky, also places with a lot of desert plants. So the desert varies a lot more than we tend to understand. But if you're thinking about the Sahel, now we're getting to a region that is a bit wetter. It has a lot more ability to support agriculture. And the word Sahel actually comes from the Arabic word that means shore. So it's like the edge of the Sahara Sea. So they're kind of framing the desert as an ocean. And the Sahel is the shore of it, because there you're getting into a place that can more easily support people. There are a few more trees, which we'll see in a minute. And there's one more thing I want you to know about this region, which is because of the rainfall patterns here and throughout the African continent, rainfall moves up through that whole region called the Sahel one time every year. So during what we call the summer here, the rain is moving north, and it goes all the way up into the region about where the Sahara is, and it sits there for a while, and then it goes south again. So between about, depending on the year exactly when the rainfall is strong and so forth, between about May and October, you can expect rain in Niger. The rest of the year, it usually does not rain at all. So not like Florida's dry season, like at least like we're seeing this year where there's some rain here and there. It's often completely dry during the rest of those months between November and April. Once in a while there's a little bit of rain, but usually there's absolutely zero. So the key time to grow crops then is going to be during that rainy season from May to October. And you can see what the landscape looks like again here. So I talked about having trees in the fields, and you see that again here. This is a view to the south of the village. The other view was to the west. You can again see there's some cattle in the background. That's what all that brown is back there. And this is again millet. So a lot of what people grow are staple grains like millet. And I'm going to talk through some of the other staple grains as well. This is again very early in the season, probably about June. That year the rains were starting pretty late. It has become more usual, and so they're probably starting, this is probably about late June. And then you can also see off to the center left of the photo, behind some of those trees, there's another crop, and that's actually a wealthier person who's dug a well This is a person who'd newly arrived when I came back from my research. There was somebody who was native to the village but hadn't lived there for years. And they are growing some more things like corn and so forth that require more water. And so they've dug a well and they're ensuring that they can grow those things too. Now, one of the things you can't see in this field yet, if you look at the foreground, it looks like it's all millet stalks. It's all just tiny little grass-like clumps. Well, they'll be putting peanuts in there too. So the peanuts will mix in and they will, for one thing, provide another source of protein-rich nutrition for people, but they also fix nitrogen. So as you'll remember, nitrogen is one of those important sources of nutrition for crops. So by having peanuts mixed in with the millet, they're ensuring that the millet will be able to grow better. Still another group of things tends to grow in among the millet as the rainy season progresses, and that's weeds. They're not planted by people, as the name weeds would suggest, but people do eat them. When they're weeding fields, they tend to pull out all of the plants that are nutritious for people and tasty for people. They pull them out and they eat those while they're waiting for the millet to ripen up, because they've been living on their harvest from way back in October, and now it's in June and July. And so they're really short on grain by that time of year. And so they're eating anything from the fields that they can find that helps to support human nutrition. Okay, now this is millet as it's gotten nice and tall. We're looking at about August here. And on the left side, you can see the plants. They're growing along a pathway out of the village. This is on the north side of the village. And again, you can see the trees that are mixed in there. The tops of those millet stalks, where it looks brown, those, brown and thin, they look like big spikes. Those are probably about 10 feet tall, so a good bit taller than a person. And on the right, you can see a close-up of what the millet looks like. It's getting close to ripe there. And you'll probably recognize that as a grain that you often see in birdseed in the United States. That's the main use we tend to make of it in the United States. But when it's green like this, just a little bit riper than this, people will start to harvest just a few stalks, just eat a little bit of fresh millet before it gets quite ripe enough to harvest to store. So at this point, it'll still have lots of moisture in it. And it's a little green, but it tastes wonderful. If you roast an ear of that, it's like a mixture of popcorn and the best nice fresh roasted bread you ever ate. It's just a really nice flavor that I've never eaten anywhere else. Wonderful stuff. But that's millet. And another one of the staple crops is sorghum. So sorghum also grows quite tall, and you can see that on the right. We've got some fairly tall sorghum stalks, and they can grow in some varieties much taller even than that. Most of the sorghum you'll see in Niger is the color that you see on the left in that bowl there. And that, along with millet, they're both very nutritious grains. When people are eating those all the time as their main source of food, that means they're getting a lot of good fiber, a lot of good vitamins, a lot of good minerals. So all of the things that help to keep people healthy, especially once you add in peanuts and some protein from those. And another thing that people grow out in their fields and mix in is beans. And so beans and peanuts help to make this a very complete protein diet. So people are doing fine without eating meat so far. We'll get to the meat in a little bit. And one of the things to know about both sorghum and millet in Niger is that they're very varied. You can see that partly in the seed color here. There's some white seeds, there's some dark brown seeds, there's some red seeds. Well, the millet and the sorghum that grow in any given person's field tend to be quite a bit different one from another. Each plant is a little different because the farmer is just saving some seeds from the previous year. So by saving those seeds from the previous year, it's a big mix of whatever has been grown over the years, and probably just a mix of some of the best ones. And the reason that's important in Niger is that, first of all, you guys know biodiversity is important. It helps to limit the loss of crops, and it helps to ensure that we have a variety of crops for other animals to eat and us to eat and so forth. And the protection of the crop through diversity is one of the reasons it's really important in Niger in particular. So if you have a whole bunch of different varieties of millet in your field and you have a drought year, some of your millet is going to survive. If you have a flood year, some of your millet is going to survive. If you have an average year, some of your millet and maybe a lot of your millet is going to survive. So the advantage of having a lot of different kinds of sorghum or millet in your field is that different plants will survive better and produce better under different conditions. And so if you have really extreme conditions, no matter what the extremes are, unless your whole field gets washed away, I have to say, which has happened with floods in recent years, but leaving aside floods, no matter what the year is like, you will likely have some production. And so that huge variety is a lot different from the very small group of genes that we tend to see in American farm fields. Even though we've gotten a little more diverse than when we had that 1970s corn failure, we still have a much more limited set of genes in our fields, of genetic variety in our fields, than they have in the fields in Niger, where they have to deal with a wide range of conditions from year to year. So having that variety is actually a good thing for farmers, which goes a little bit against some of what you saw in the FAO video, which is an interesting thing to consider. So you have to think about, what is the FAO advocating and what are they trying to accomplish? Which is a good question. I'm going to leave you guys to think about that one for now. Okay, so another one of the crops that's really important in Niger, as I mentioned, is peanuts. And in the photo on the right, down near the bottom, you can see some peanut plants. They're the broadleafed plants that are pretty big. There are two peanut plants pretty close to the skirt of the woman who's wearing the green shirt and the green, red, and blue skirt. So those peanut plants, they're broadleafed, and you can see that the way that they're growing the peanuts here is interesting because there seems to be a sort of trench behind the peanuts. And what the women have done is they've dug a big trench, filled it with manure, and then they're doing all of their watering into that trench. And so that gives the peanuts a lot of nutrition to work with. It gives their roots a place to go down deep to grab at water. And this is also a way to minimize water losses in the system. Now, as I mentioned, I believe there are a lot of winds that can blow through this area. Niger can be a very windy place, especially during rainy season as the storms come through. And you want to minimize the losses of water. And so if you have a trench that's down a little bit, and you can see this trench is even protected by chunks of rock on either side, then the trench is going to be able to retain more water. It'll lose less when winds come through. And so the peanuts have a great place to find water and the nutrition that they need. And then on the left, you see peanut butter. And people in Niger don't generally eat peanut butter. Instead, like you saw in the FAO video, they'll separate out the peanut solids from the oil. And that's because women use the oil and the solids to make money. So the women who grow peanuts, they tend to grow them in among the millet and sorghum that's grown by men. And the oil they will sell to people in the market, and people will use it just like we use any other ordinary cooking oil here in the United States. Some people in the United States cook with peanut oil even. And then the solids, they'll mash those up into balls and let them dry. And then those dried balls, they'll sell in a little Ziploc bag. They'll sell a few at a time, and people will mash those up and use them to help flavor their sauces. And they're a part of this dish that's really good. You mash up the peanut solids and some salt and some chilies, and you put all that with a little bit of a dressing, an oily dressing, on top of some greens that are cooked. And I know it probably doesn't sound appealing, but it's one of the most amazing things. So peanuts, solids, peanut oil, they're two big money makers for women who are able to farm. And a lot of times these days that is having to happen in fields that their husbands own, whereas in the past, women usually had their own fields. Another crop that women often grow is rice. And here on the left, you see a friend of mine weeding her rice field. All of that grass-like stuff you can see is rice. And on the right, of course, you see the rice grains after they're all processed. And one of the things to understand about rice in Niger is that it's often grown as upland rice, which is a different variety from that that's grown in the wetlands that you often see for China. So this is not paddy rice. This is upland rice, grown in the dry. And that rice is still going to need moisture, but it's not going to be grown covered up with water for most of the time. And because it needs moisture, A lot of women told me when I was doing my research that they were starting to have challenges with growing rice that they hadn't had before. Their rice fields were shrinking. A lot of years it was much harder to find a place that had enough water to grow that was still, they were still allowed to use. And so women have been losing their agricultural area. Another reason women have been losing their farm areas is that as population has grown, and Niger has the fastest population growth in the world, people have started dividing their fields up more and more as they have their children inherit them. And men and women both have started to pass their fields on only to their male children because they're afraid that they won't have enough fields to pass to all of their children. So in the past, women used to usually have fields just the way men did, but oftentimes now women are getting more and more limited out of their fields. And that can be a problem because women have to support themselves when men are out of town. And another thing to know about women's work in agriculture in Niger is that women do a lot of the processing work for food. So on the left-hand side, you can see a young woman who's been doing threshing. So that long stick, that long curved stick that she's holding, she's using it to beat the sorghum that's behind her. So the sorghum stalks, they still have seeds attached, and she'll beat that until all the seeds fall off. And then she'll remove and sweep aside all of the chaff, all those big pieces of stalk and so forth. And she'll clean up all the sorghum, and then she'll take that out and kind of move it back and forth in a basket to let the wind blow away the rest of the chaff. So that will prepare it to be just seeds like you saw in the bowl before. In the middle, you see a woman with a mortar and pestle. And women work 4 or 5 hours a day, every day, pounding up the seeds of millet and the seeds of sorghum into flour. And then they cook it into a ball, and then they pound that ball up with a bunch of water and sometimes with milk and spices, and people drink that as a porridge. It's one of the major foods that people drink on a daily basis in Niger. So it's a lot of heavy physical labor, all that pounding with a stick, all that threshing with the curved stick. And then on the right, we see another way women sometimes process food, and this is a fairly recent innovation, but people will buy soybeans that are imported, and they will turn them into tofu. So that's what my friend Tabizu has done here, is she's bought soybeans, she's cooked them, she's extracted the liquids, kept the solids, and turned them into tofu. And she'll cook them up with the tofu up with some spices, with some onions, and then her daughters will go out in the village and sell bits of tofu as a snack to people. Obviously a very rich source of protein nutrition for people. And then here we get another glimpse of the granaries on the left. So you can again see that they're curved. They're set up on rocks so that mice and so forth can't easily get into them. All of that is carefully mudded over every year with fresh new mud to protect it from cracks and so forth. And then, like I said, people will lean a ladder up against the granary, remove that little millet stalk roof, and then they'll climb down inside, get out the millet that they need for the day, and then those millet stalks or their sorghum stalks will be given to a woman to thresh. So it's done on a daily basis. But the granaries are usually something for the men, and so when men go away to work in Nigeria during the cold season, for example, women often don't have access to this. So that's partly why their rice stores are important. So they keep the rice in the household, and they have to ensure that they have something to cook up the kids every day. And so that's where the rice and the peanuts and so forth come in important. On the right, you can see the way that people tend to cook. A pot set up on 3 rocks or thereabouts, and then sticks underneath and a fire, and that's how you cook all your food. And women usually cook in pots this big every day because they're feeding a lot of people in each household. Here we see dry season gardening. So I mentioned how the rains only come from about May to October. And in the background, you can see how dry it gets. The only green you can see in the background is on the trees, and even those are a lot sparser green than they usually are. In the foreground, we see a lot of onions, and all of this, there's some lettuce too, and a few tomatoes, but mostly onions. And so people started growing onions as a way to make money during the dry season, and they needed wells to do it. My village couldn't afford wells, so while I was a Peace Corps volunteer there, one of the things I helped make happen was get money to dig some wells so people could grow onions. And there are a lot of complications with the onion market, but we'll leave it at that for the moment. The last piece we haven't talked about is meat. So at Tabaski and 2 other important Muslim holidays, people eat meat in the village. Most of the rest of the year, they don't really eat meat. And here we see them preparing a goat that's been slaughtered for this big holiday, and they will take care of the whole goat, share it out with the whole family, you know, after they've cooked it up. And that will be one of the 3 times a year that they tend to eat much meat at all. So that's the overview of Niger. So I'm asking you guys to use this information to answer those questions that I've got on the discussion board. And please feel free to ask me questions. Like I said, I hope to be in with you guys again next week. Wednesday will be online again in some format. And please feel free to send me any emails. And I'm glad I'll be doing office hours tomorrow online as well. So feel free to get in touch with me. Let me know by email if you'd like to meet on Skype, if you'd like to meet on FaceTime or some other platform. Just let me know and we'll try to get together on online for office hours as well. All right, folks, have a great day. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.